The entire courtroom laughed when my son held up one of my old shoes. Your Honor, my father still wears these. He can't remember when he bought them, what he signed last week, or even where half his money went. My daughter-in-law placed a thick medical report on the judge's desk and smiled. It's time someone took control of his life. I kept my eyes on the floor. Then the judge opened the report and asked a single question. 3 seconds later, nobody was laughing, and the knot I'd carried in my chest for 22 months finally began to loosen. Welcome to Father's Vengeance. Before we begin, I'd love to hear from you. Drop a quick comment. Have you ever had to stand up against someone you trusted? Yes or no is enough. Your perspective matters here. Quick note. This story includes some fictionalized elements for impact, but the lesson at its core is what I hope stays with you. The fluorescent lights in courtroom 5B buzzed like trapped hornets, and I had been staring at them for 20 minutes while my son's lawyer made a performance of examining my shoes. At 69, I sat motionless in my worn gray suit and scuffed brown Oxford shoes, the retired FBI forensic accountant appearing every bit the frail widower my son wanted the court to see. The leather was cracked across the toes, the heels worn down on the outside edges from 43 years of walking. Preston Ridgway, 45 and charging $650 per hour, specialized in elder law with the smooth confidence of someone accustomed to easy victories. He circled the defense table like a prosecutor, gesturing at me as though I were evidence. Your Honor, Preston said, his voice carrying the practiced sympathy of a funeral director. We're here today because Mr. Merrick no longer possesses the cognitive capacity to manage a complex estate valued at over $23 million. I kept my hands folded on the table. Judge Marianne Colby, 58, with silver-streaked hair pulled into a neat bun, watched from the bench with the neutral expression of someone who had seen every variation of family greed. She had read my forensic accounting textbook during law school 20 years ago. I wondered if she remembered the name on the cover. Brent Merrick, my son, 40 years old and dressed in an expensive navy suit that cost more than my entire wardrobe, sat beside Preston with the practiced expression of filial concern. His wife, Roxanne Fielding, 38, and immaculately dressed in charcoal gray, leaned close to whisper something. Her eyes flicked to my shoes. Look at those shoes, Roxanne murmured just loud enough for me to hear. That's a man who has nothing left to lose. I'd been wearing these shoes for nearly 40 years. Lorraine gave them to me on my first morning at the FBI, pressing the box into my hands outside the Chicago field office, while our 2-year-old son was home with her mother. She'd saved 3 months of diner wages for them. When she died, these were the shoes I wore to her funeral. They were the last things she touched before the cancer took her. She'd asked to hold them one final time in the hospital, just to feel the leather. The petition requests total guardianship, medical and financial, to be granted to his son, Brent Merrick, who seeks only to protect his father's dignity. Preston continued pacing in front of the judge's bench. Mr. Merrick has become increasingly confused about basic financial matters. He's made questionable decisions regarding his assets, shown memory lapses in crucial conversations, and demonstrated an inability to understand the complexity of his own estate. I watched Preston's reflection in the polished wood of the table. He moved with the choreographed precision of someone who had delivered this speech dozens of times. Brent nodded along, his jaw set in what was supposed to pass for reluctant determination. The courtroom smelled like old paper and floor polish. The morning sun came through the tall windows on my right, illuminating dust motes that drifted through the stale air. I counted them for a moment, a habit from 3 decades of waiting for witnesses to incriminate themselves. Your Honor, I'd like to enter into evidence Exhibit A, Preston said, holding up a thick folder. A comprehensive neuropsychological evaluation conducted by Dr. Clifford Bentley, a licensed clinical neuropsychologist. The name landed in my chest like a stone dropping into still water. The evaluation documents significant short-term memory deficits. Preston read from the report, his voice taking on the authoritative tone of someone quoting medical scripture. The patient exhibits marked decline in his ability to process complex financial information. Dr. Bentley concludes that Mr. Merrick shows clear signs of mild cognitive impairment and early-onset memory loss consistent with progressive dementia. I kept my face carefully blank. The performance required stillness. Preston handed the folder to the court clerk, who passed it to Judge Colby. She opened it and began reading, her expression unchanged. My son shifted in his chair, straightening his already straight tie. The evaluation details several concerning incidents. Preston continued. Inability to recall recent conversations, confusion about account balances, difficulty managing household bills. The documented symptoms paint a clear picture of a man who can no longer safely manage his own affairs. I raised my hand slightly, the gesture small and hesitant, exactly what they expected from a confused old man. Your Honor, I said, my voice quiet. May I see the name of the examining physician? Judge Colby looked up from the report. Mr. Ridgway, please show Mr. Merrick the signature page. Preston walked over and held the document in front of me, his finger pointing to the signature at the bottom. I leaned forward as though my vision needed the extra inches. The signature was rushed and nearly illegible, but the printed name below it was crystal clear. Dr. Clifford Bentley, Ph.D. Clinical Neuropsychology. I hadn't heard that name in 7 years, but I remembered everything about him. That's the thing about memory. It works exactly as well as you need it to. I pulled the small notepad from my breast pocket, the leather cover soft from years of use. I wrote the name down with the same careful precision I'd used for 30 years at the FBI. Each letter formed exactly as I'd been trained. Preston watched me write, probably thinking I was struggling to remember, to hold on to some fragment of clarity. He had no idea I'd been the forensic accountant who helped suspend Dr. Clifford Bentley's license in 2019 for falsifying patient evaluations in a Medicare fraud case. The doctor had signed off on dementia diagnoses for 17 patients who were perfectly competent, enabling a nursing home consortium to fraudulently bill for enhanced care services. I closed the notepad and slipped it back into my pocket. Thank you, I said quietly. Preston returned to his position in front of the bench, building his case on a foundation of fraudulent medical testimony. Roxanne whispered something else to Brent, and he nodded, his expression settling into satisfaction. I looked down at my scuffed Oxford shoes, at the leather Lorraine had touched when she tied the ribbon around the box. These shoes had walked me through her funeral, through 22 months of investigation, through the careful, methodical process of documenting every lie my son and his wife had constructed. Dr. Clifford Bentley's name sat in my breast pocket notepad, right below the list of shell companies' fraudulent transfers and forged documents I'd been cataloging since June of last year, but I wasn't ready to reveal that yet. Not until my son took the witness stand and looked me in the eye while swearing to tell the truth. Preston closed the medical report and turned toward the gallery. Your Honor, I'd like to call Brent Merrick to the stand. My son stood up when his name was called, adjusting his expensive navy suit jacket before walking to the witness box. He moved with the confident stride of someone who had rehearsed this moment, who had convinced himself he was doing the right thing. The court clerk administered the oath, and Brent raised his right hand without hesitation. Do you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? I do, Brent said. The words hung in the air between us. I kept my hands folded on the table, my expression neutral. 40 years of interrogations had taught me that silence is the most powerful question you can ask. Mr. Merrick, Preston began, standing at a respectful distance from the witness box. Can you describe some specific incidents that raised concerns about your father's cognitive state? Brent shifted in his seat, his gaze settling somewhere above my head. Last month I arrived at his home to find the stove burner still on from breakfast. He'd left the house hours earlier and had no memory of using it. When I asked him about it, he seemed confused, said he couldn't remember making eggs that morning. I remembered that morning perfectly. I'd made oatmeal, not eggs. The stove had been off. Brent had a key to my house that I'd given him 3 years ago, back when I still trusted him. Are there other incidents? Preston asked. He's paid the same utility bill 3 times in the past 6 months, Brent said, his voice taking on the practiced tone of worried concern, each time insisting it was the first payment. I've tried to help him set up automatic payments, but he refuses. Says he's always paid his own bills and doesn't need help. The utility company had made an error in their billing system, sending duplicate notices with different account numbers. I'd caught it on the second statement and spent 2 hours on the phone getting it corrected. I had the documentation in my briefcase. Brent knew this. I'd copied him on the email to the company supervisor. And his memory regarding legal documents? Preston prompted. Brent's eyes flickered toward me for the first time since taking the stand. Our gazes locked for exactly 3 seconds. In that moment, I saw everything. The rehearsal with Preston, the late-night conversations with Roxanne, the calculations about what they'd do with the money, and underneath it all, a flicker of something that might have been shame. He looked away first. He signed documents last year giving me power of attorney for medical decisions. Brent said, his voice slightly less steady now. When I referenced them last month, he had no memory of signing them. He seemed genuinely confused about why I would have that authority. I had never signed those documents. I'd seen them for the first time 2 weeks ago when Preston filed them with the court. The signature was close, but the angle of the capital L in Leland was wrong. Whoever had forged it had used my signature from my published textbook as a reference, not realizing I'd changed the way I signed official documents after Lorraine died. My son had always been a decent liar, but he'd never been able to lie to my face. Those 3 seconds of eye contact had told me everything I needed to see. He knew exactly what he was doing, and part of him hated himself for it. "Thank you, Mr. Merrick," Preston said, returning to his position near the bench. "Your Honor, based on the medical evaluation and Mr. Merrick's testimony, we believe the evidence clearly demonstrates the need for immediate intervention." He lifted a thick stack of documents from his table and approached Judge Colby's bench. The petition requests total guardianship, both medical and financial, granted to Mr. Brent Merrick with immediate authority to make all decisions regarding his father's care and assets. Preston laid out each page with theatrical precision, explaining the scope as though he were offering a gift rather than dismantling a life. Immediate sale of the residential property valued at $1.1 million, he continued. Transition to Meadowbrook Senior Care, a licensed memory care facility where Mr. Merrick can receive 24-hour supervision and full fiduciary authority over liquid assets currently totaling $23.6 million. $23.6 million. My life's work. 30 years of tracking money through shell corporations and offshore accounts, teaching federal agents how to follow the paper trail. Royalties from a textbook used in 40 law schools. Careful investments. Lorraine's life insurance. The house we'd bought in 1987 and paid off 15 years ago. They wanted all of it. "Your Honor," Preston said, his voice dropping into a register of practiced solemnity, "Mr. Merrick deserves to be cared for properly in a supervised facility where professionals can ensure his safety and well-being. His family is simply trying to protect him from the confusion and potential harm that comes with unsupervised decline." Brent sat in the witness box, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. Roxanne watched from the gallery with the satisfied expression of someone who believed the performance had gone exactly as planned. Judge Colby set down the documents and looked up. Her eyes moved from Preston to Brent, then settled on me. "Mr. Merrick," she said, her voice carrying the careful neutrality of someone who had seen families destroy themselves over money countless times before. "You may respond if you wish." The courtroom went quiet. Even the fluorescent lights seemed to stop their buzzing. I rose slowly from the defense table, my joints protesting the movement in a way that probably looked convincing to everyone watching. Old man standing up. Confused widower trying to understand why his family was doing this to him. I placed my hands flat on the worn oak surface and looked down at my scuffed brown Oxford shoes for exactly 1 second. 11 years since Lorraine died. 40 federal cases built on fraudulent financial documents. 147 documented transactions flowing through Brent and Roxanne's shell company over the past 22 months. I looked up at Judge Colby. "Yes, Your Honor," I said quietly. "I'd like to respond." Roxanne had looked at these shoes this morning and seen a man with nothing left to lose. She was right about the shoes telling a story. She just had no idea what story they were actually telling. The judge was waiting, and I had a story to tell, one that started 43 years ago with a shoebox and a young woman who knew exactly who I was. The shoes were 40 years old that morning, and the memory of the woman who gave them to me was still sharp enough to cut. I looked at Judge Colby, then down at the scuffed brown Oxford leather one more time. September 15th, 1985. Lorraine Merrick, 30 years old with dark hair pulled back in a ponytail, stood outside the FBI Chicago field office, holding a shoebox wrapped in brown paper. I was 31, wearing a borrowed suit 2 sizes too large, about to walk into my first day as a forensic accountant trainee. Our son Brent, 2 years old, was home with Lorraine's mother. "I saved 3 months for these, Leland," she said, pressing the box into my hands. Her fingers were rough from diner shifts, but her grip was steady. "Wear them when you need to remember who you are." I opened the box, brown Oxford leather, plain and sturdy. "They cost more than our rent." "Lorraine, you didn't have to." "Yes, I did," she said, cutting me off. "Promise me you'll keep them, even when they get old and scuffed and people tell you to throw them away. I slipped them on right there on the sidewalk. They fit perfectly. Lorraine had traced my foot on newspaper while I slept. "They're for remembering," she said quietly. "When you're counting other people's money, when you see what people do for it, you remember who you are. You're the man who doesn't." I kissed her and walked through security in shoes that cost 3 months of tips. I wore them every day for 30 years. The courtroom came back into focus. Judge Colby waiting, Brent in the witness box. 40 years later, I realized Lorraine had known something I didn't, that the most dangerous thing you carry into a fight isn't a weapon. It's the memory of who you were before the fight began. I spent 3 decades in sterile field offices and federal courtrooms, green banker's lamps at 2 in the morning, testimony in cases where I'd traced money through shell corporations, in the Caymans through wire transfers bouncing across 5 countries before landing in a cousin's restaurant in Queens. I built cases against 3 organized crime families, expert witness in 47 federal trials. I learned to see patterns in financial documents the way others read faces: wire fraud, money laundering, elder financial exploitation, every variation. The shoes got scuffed. The leather cracked across the toes. I had them resoled twice. Lorraine never told me to replace them. In 1991, Brent was 8 years old. I came home late one Thursday, briefcase full of banking records from a Medicare fraud case. He was at the kitchen table while Lorraine made grilled cheese. "What do you do at work, Dad?" he asked. I sat across from him. "I count other people's money, son. I follow it when they try to hide it." His eyes went wide. "Like a treasure hunt?" "Sort of, but the treasure belongs to someone else, and the people hiding it aren't supposed to have it." He thought about this, his small face serious. "Is it fun following the money?" Lorraine looked up from the stove. Something flickered across her face. "It's only fun when you catch them," I told him, "when you prove where the money went and who took it." He nodded and went back to his homework. I'd been doing this job for 6 years when my son asked that question. I did it for 24 more. Retired in 2015 with commendations and a pension and a textbook used in 40 law schools. The shoes were 30 years old by then, and Lorraine was already sick. I should have given him a different answer. Should have told him that following money destroys something in you, that seeing what people do for it makes you wonder if anyone is who they say they are. But I didn't know that yet. Not in 1991. Not even in 2015, when I walked out of the FBI building for the last time. I didn't know until May 2022, when Lorraine called me to her hospital bed 3 weeks before the cancer took her. In the courtroom, I straightened my shoulders. These shoes had walked me through 40 years of cases. 40 years of following money. People thought they'd hidden well enough. Brent had asked if it was fun, and I told him it was only fun when people were hiding it. 32 years later, my son was hiding money from me. $527,000 moved through a shell company called Magnolia Events LLC, wire fraud, asset concealment, conspiracy. There was nothing fun about it at all. Brent sat in the witness box, his expensive suit probably costing more than Lorraine's 3 months of wages. He wouldn't look at me. I'd taught him about shell companies in 2003, explaining over Thanksgiving dinner how criminals hide money by creating fake businesses. He was 20, home from college. He'd ask good questions. I'd been proud. 20 years later, he'd used everything I taught him. "Your Honor," I said quietly, my voice steady. "These shoes are 40 years old. My wife gave them to me on my first day at the FBI. She told me to wear them when I needed to remember who I was." Judge Colby leaned forward. "I wore them for 30 years, while I built cases against people who stole from the vulnerable. While I testified about wire fraud and money laundering and financial exploitation." I paused. "I wore them yesterday when I finished documenting 147 fraudulent transactions made by my son and his wife over the past 22 months. Roxanne's face went pale. Brent's hand gripped the witness box. "But I didn't know any of that yet," I continued. "Not in 2015 when I retired. Not until Lorraine called me to her hospital bed 18 months ago, 3 weeks before she died. I didn't know any of it was coming. Not until Lorraine called me to her bedside in May of 2022 and told me our son was planning to erase me. The hospital room smelled like disinfectant and something sweet. They pumped through the ventilation system to cover the smell of death. Lorraine was 67, and the pancreatic cancer had reduced her to angles and shadows under white sheets. She'd been in room 4127 for 2 weeks. The doctor said she had maybe 3 more. I sat in the vinyl chair next to her bed, holding her hand. Her fingers felt like bird bones wrapped in paper. I heard them, Leland, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Last week, standing right outside this door, thinking I was asleep. Who? Brent and Roxanne. She squeezed my hand with what little strength she had left. Talking about the accounts, about the house, about the timeline once I'm gone. The machines beside her bed beeped steadily. I could hear voices in the hallway, a medication cart rolling past someone's television playing through the wall. What did they say? I asked. She closed her eyes for a moment, gathering strength. Roxanne asked if the lawyer had everything ready. Brent said yes, but they had to wait until after. She asked how long. He said 6 months, maybe less, depending on how confused you seemed. My chest felt hollow. Lorraine, why didn't you say anything to them? Why didn't you? Because I can't protect you from behind this bed, she said, cutting me off. Her eyes opened and they were clear and sharp, despite everything else failing. So I'm leaving you something better than silence. She pointed weakly toward the bedside table. Third drawer, the blue notebook. I opened the drawer. Inside was a small cloth-bound notebook, the kind you'd use for grocery lists. I pulled it out. Open it, she whispered. The first page was dated April 18th, 2022. Lorraine's handwriting, tight and precise despite the tremor in her hands, filled the lines. Overheard B on phone in kitchen, Magnolia events, wire transfer, couldn't hear him out. I flipped through the pages. 17 pages. Dates, partial sentences, bank names, numbers. You've been documenting this, I said quietly. For 6 weeks, she confirmed. Every conversation I could hear from this bed. Every phone call Brent made in the hallway thinking I couldn't understand. Every time Roxanne visited and whispered about the doctor. My wife, dying in a hospital bed with maybe 3 weeks left, had done what every good investigator does. First, she documented everything. While I was reading her medical charts and pretending we had time, she was building a case. I looked at page 7. R asked B about guardianship petition timeline. He said wait until after. She said make sure the doctor's locked in. Dr. Bentley, Lorraine whispered. They mentioned his name twice. Said he owed Roxanne a favor from way back. I turned to page 17, the last entry. Her handwriting was shakier here, written 3 days ago. L follow the LLC. Everything runs through the LLC. I love you. I pressed her hand to my lips. She was crying, tears sliding down into her hair. I'm sorry, she whispered. I'm sorry I can't help you fight this. You just did, I told her. She died 3 weeks later on June 3rd, 2022. I held her hand until the machines stopped beeping. 2 weeks after the funeral, I sat alone in my home office on the 2nd floor. It was past midnight. The only light came from the desk lamp, casting a circle of yellow across the worn oak surface. I'd been avoiding the blue notebook. It sat in my briefcase like something radioactive. But that night I finally opened it. 17 pages. I read every word. Lorraine hadn't written a journal. She'd written an investigation file. Dates matched to conversations. Partial account numbers she'd glimpsed on papers Brent left on the counter. Names of banks overheard during phone calls. Fragments of dialogue transcribed with the precision of someone who understood exactly what I'd need. Page 3, May 2nd. Heard R tell B she moved another 8,000. He said keep it under 10 per transfer. She laughed, said she knows the reporting threshold. Page 9. May 15th, B on phone with someone named Preston. Mentioned neuropsych evaluation. Said Dad won't suspect anything, he's too trusting. Page 12. May 22nd. Overheard R in hallway. Said the LLC account is at $380,000 now. Just need to get the house sold fast once the guardianship goes through. 17 pages. 43 separate entries. 11 partial bank account numbers. 6 overheard phone conversations transcribed in her careful sloping handwriting. She'd given me the first thread. Now I just had to follow it. I opened my old laptop, the secure one I'd used for FBI work. Booted up the encryption software I'd installed a decade ago. Created a new folder. Merrick_investigation_062022. I opened a blank spreadsheet and stared at the cursor, blinking in cell A1. The first entry took me 4 hours to properly document and cross-reference. I started with Magnolia Events LLC. A Delaware incorporation search showed it registered in March 2021. Sole managing member, Roxanne Fielding. I created columns, date, source, transaction type, amount, account, status. By sunrise, I'd confirmed 7 separate wire transfers into the LLC account, all under $50,000. The federal reporting threshold, I'd been following threads like this for 30 years. Shell companies, structured payments, money moving through corporate veils designed to hide beneficial ownership. I'd testified about schemes exactly like this one in federal courtrooms across 3 states. The difference was, this time it was my own family at the end of the line. I looked at Lorena's last entry again. Follow the LLC. Everything runs through the LLC. I followed it. For 17 months, I followed every thread, every transaction, every lie. But I couldn't think about that yet. I had to get back to the courtroom where Judge Colby was still waiting for my response. The courtroom came back into focus. The fluorescent lights, the worn oak table, Preston's confident posture, my son's carefully blank face, and I was ready. 17 months. That's how long I'd followed the threads Lorraine gave me. Now Judge Colby was waiting, and it was time to pull them. I stood slowly from the defense table. My knees protested the movement, a genuine stiffness from sitting too long. Let them see the 70-year-old man struggling to his feet. Let them think what they'd been thinking all morning. Then I spoke. "Your Honor," I said, and my voice came out clear and steady with none of the hesitance Preston had been painting for the past hour. "Before we discuss my alleged mental capacity, I'd like to address something more pressing." Preston's head snapped toward me. Judge Colby's eyebrows rose slightly. "My son has been using my name to secure unauthorized commercial loans since January of 2022. I continued letting each word land with the precision I'd learned testifying in federal court. I have certified bank records, forensic handwriting analysis, original loan documents, wire transfer receipts. Shall we start there?" No one moved. Even the court reporter's fingers hovered above her keyboard waiting. Brent's face had gone pale. Roxanne's hand, which had been resting on the gallery bench behind him, slowly withdrew. Preston recovered first. "Objection, Your Honor, this is completely outside the scope of—" "Of what?" I asked, turning to face him directly. "Outside the scope of a petition that claims I can't manage my own finances. I'd say my son's unauthorized use of my identity to secure loans is directly relevant to the question of who should control my assets." I reached down and unlatched my weathered leather briefcase. The brass clasps clicked in the silent courtroom. Inside was a folder, thick and neatly bound, organized with the same color-coded tabs I'd used for 30 years of federal investigations. I lifted it out and placed it squarely on the defense table. The thud of paper on oak echoed through the room. "This is documentation of 147 separate fraudulent transactions," I said, "executed by my son Brent Merrick and his wife Roxanne Fielding between January 2022 and October 2023. Total value $527,000. Preston was on his feet now. "Your Honor, I must object to this ambush." "It's not an ambush when you're the one who initiated these proceedings," I said calmly. "You filed a petition claiming I'm cognitively impaired. I'm responding by demonstrating that I've spent the last 17 months conducting a forensic investigation that would challenge most certified accountants. I'd spent 17 months waiting for this exact moment. Lorraine had given me the first thread in that blue notebook. I'd followed it through bank records, shell companies, forged signatures, and wire transfers that crossed 3 state lines. Now it was time to show them what I'd found." Judge Colby held up one hand. "Mr. Ridgway, sit down." Mr. Merrick approached the bench. I walked forward carrying the folder. My scuffed Oxford shoes made no sound on the courtroom carpet. I could feel every eye in the room on me, the frail widower in the worn gray suit, suddenly speaking with the methodical authority of someone who had spent 3 decades building federal cases. I handed the folder to the court clerk, a young woman in her 20s, who accepted it with both hands, surprised by the weight. "Your Honor," I said, "the first section documents 3 commercial loans obtained between January and March of 2022. Total value $340,000. Each loan application bears my signature. I've included forensic handwriting analysis from Dr. Helena Carmichael, a certified document examiner, confirming that all 3 signatures were forged." The clerk passed the folder to Judge Colby. She opened it to the first tab section. I continued. "The second section documents wire transfers from those loan proceeds into a Delaware limited liability company called Magnolia Events LLC. Roxanne Fielding is the sole managing member. The company has no business operations, no employees, no legitimate purpose. It exists only to receive and distribute fraudulent funds." Brent was staring at the table in front of him. His hands were gripped together so tightly his knuckles had gone white. The third section, I said, documents the pattern of structured cash withdrawals designed to avoid federal reporting requirements. No single withdrawal exceeds $9,000. That's $1,000 below the $10,000 threshold that would trigger a currency transaction report to FinCEN. I taught a seminar on structuring in 2008, explained to a room full of FBI agents exactly how criminals break large transactions into smaller pieces to evade detection. Brent had been 25 then visiting me at the Chicago office. He'd sat in the back row taking notes. Your Honor, Preston said, his voice strained now. Even if these allegations have merit, they don't negate the medical evidence of Mr. Merrick's cognitive decline. The medical evidence signed by Dr. Clifford Bentley, I asked. The same Dr. Bentley whose license was suspended by the Illinois Department of Financial and Professional Regulation in 2019 for falsifying patient evaluations in a Medicare fraud case. Preston's mouth opened. Nothing came out. I was the forensic accountant on that case, I said quietly. I testified about Dr. Bentley's pattern of signing dementia diagnoses for patients who were cognitively intact. The state suspended his license for 3 years. It was reinstated in 2022, 6 months before he signed the evaluation, claiming I'm mentally incompetent. Preston objected. Of course he did. But Judge Colby had already picked up the first document from the folder, and I watched the expression on her face change the way it always does when someone sees numbers that don't add up. She was reading the forensic handwriting report. Her eyes moved down the page, taking in Dr. Carmichael's analysis of the forged signatures, the detailed comparison of letter formations, pen pressure stroke patterns. The room had gone very quiet. That particular silence, I knew it all. It's the sound of a courtroom recalibrating of everyone in the room, simultaneously revising their understanding of what kind of case this actually is. Judge Colby was still reading the first page, her pen motionless above her legal pad. Preston was already moving toward the bench trying to recover, but he had no idea what was in that folder, or that it was just the beginning. Judge Colby set down the first page and looked at Preston with an expression I'd seen on federal judges 100 times before the moment they realized someone's been lying to them. The courtroom had gone absolutely still. Even the fluorescent lights seemed to have stopped buzzing. Your Honor, I said, my voice steady, I'd like to formally introduce Exhibit A, a commercial loan application filed at First Midwest Bank on March 14, 2022, bearing what appears to be my signature authorizing a $340,000 business loan. I walked to the clerk's desk and placed the first document on top. The clerk accepted it with both hands, glanced at the signature, then passed it to Judge Colby. Accompanying this, I continued, is a certified forensic analysis from Dr. Helena Carmichael, a court-recognized document examiner with 23 years of experience, testifying in federal fraud cases. The second document went to the clerk. This one was thicker, 18 pages of detailed analysis with photographs, magnified signature comparisons, and technical assessments of pen pressure, stroke pattern, and letter formation. Dr. Carmichael's report, I said, conclusively demonstrates that the signature on the loan application is a deliberate forgery, not a rushed forgery, Your Honor, a calculated one. Someone spent time practicing my signature before applying it to a legal document. Judge Colby was reading the report now, her reading glasses perched on her nose. I could see her eyes moving down the page, taking in the technical language, the comparative photographs, showing my genuine signature next to the forged one. The third document, I said, consists of bank records from First Midwest Bank showing the complete chain of custody for those funds. The entire sum, $340,000, was wired on March 17, 2022 to a Delaware limited liability company called Magnolia Events. I placed the final document on the clerk's desk. Bank statements, wire transfer receipts, account opening documentation. Magnolia Events, LLC, I continued, is managed solely by my daughter-in-law, Roxanne Fielding. The company has no business operations, no employees, no website, no office address. It exists for one purpose: to receive funds obtained through fraudulent use of my identity. Brent had his eyes closed now. Roxanne was perfectly still, her face a mask. Judge Colby finished reading the forensic report and looked up at Preston. Mr. Ridgway, do you have a response to this? Preston stood quickly, too quickly. His chair scraped against the floor. Your Honor, he said, and I could hear the strain in his voice now. Signature variations are common in elderly individuals. What Mr. Merrick characterizes as forgery could simply be his own signatures executed at different times with varying levels of awareness. He was trying to spin it, trying to use the fraud as evidence of the cognitive decline he'd been alleging all morning. In fact, Preston continued, warming to his theme, the inconsistency in signing documents without full memory of doing so actually supports our position regarding his diminished capacity. Counselor, Judge Colby interrupted, her voice sharp. Did you read Dr. Carmichael's report? I haven't had the opportunity to review. The signature isn't inconsistent, Judge Colby said. According to this analysis, it's forged. There's a difference. $340,000, forged signature, wired to a shell company my daughter-in-law controlled. And that was just the first loan, the one I'd chosen to lead with, because the forensic evidence was absolutely unassailable. Preston tried again. Your Honor, even accepting the forensic analysis, it's possible Mr. Merrick signed documents provided by his son and simply doesn't remember. Mr. Merrick, Judge Colby said, turning to me, do you wish to respond to counsel's characterization? Yes, Your Honor. I paused, letting the courtroom settle into complete silence. If I were suffering from memory loss, as counsel suggests, I would not have retained certified copies of every single wire transfer authorization form my son submitted to 4 different financial institutions over the past 14 months. I reached into my briefcase and pulled out another folder, this one tabbed and organized with the same precision as the first. May I enter those as Exhibit B? I asked. Judge Colby nodded slowly. You may. I walked the folder to the clerk's desk. 43 separate documents, Your Honor. Each one a wire transfer authorization bearing my alleged signature. Each one analyzed by Dr. Carmichael. Each one conclusively identified as a forgery. Preston's face had gone from confident to pale to something approaching gray. Furthermore, I continued, I've retained copies of every legitimate document I actually did sign during this same period. Bank deposits, tax returns, medical forms, all authenticated with my genuine signature. The contrast is quite clear when you compare them side by side. I'd spent 30 years building cases on paper trails, following money through shell companies, documenting patterns of fraud. I knew exactly what evidence a federal prosecutor would need to bring wire fraud charges, so I documented everything the same way I would have if I were still wearing the FBI badge instead of scuffed Oxford shoes. Your Honor, Preston said, his voice tight now, we maintain that the underlying medical evidence of cognitive impairment from Dr. Bentley, I said quietly, whose medical license was suspended for 3 years for falsifying patient evaluations in a Medicare fraud scheme. I testified in that case, Your Honor. I can provide the case number if the court wishes to verify. Preston sat down. He didn't have a response to that. Neither did Brent, who was staring at the defense table like he might disappear into it. But Roxanne had stopped looking at me entirely. Her fingers laced together on the table in front of her, the quiet, deliberate gesture of someone running calculations behind a neutral face. Judge Colby was reading through the wire transfer authorizations, now comparing the forged signatures to the authenticated examples I'd provided. Her pen moved across her legal pad, making notes. The only sound was Judge Colby's pen moving across her legal pad. That particular kind of silence that happens when everyone is recalculating their understanding of a situation simultaneously. Preston settled back into his chair, the confident smirk from an hour ago completely erased. Brent was motionless, his expensive navy suit suddenly looking like a costume he'd worn to play a role he didn't understand. But Roxanne wasn't panicking. She was recalculating. That was the thing about Roxanne I'd always respected. Even as I was building the case against her, she never stopped thinking. She was strategic, methodical, always 3 steps ahead. She just ran out of options to think with, because she didn't know yet that the $340,000 was only the opening exhibit, or that I had another $187,000 in documented wire fraud waiting in the next folder. I didn't give them time to recover. I reached for the second folder and placed it on the clerk's desk while Preston was still processing the first exhibit. Your Honor, I said, I'm now entering Exhibit C, the Delaware Corporate Incorporation records for Magnolia Events LLC filed June 17, 2022, listing Roxanne Fielding as sole managing member. The clerk accepted the folder and passed it to Judge Colby. I watched her open it, her reading glasses still perched on her nose from reviewing the previous documents. This entity, I continued, was created 1 month after my wife died. The incorporation documents list a registered agent address in Wilmington, Delaware, a standard mail forwarding service used by thousands of shell companies. No physical office, no employees, no business license in any state. Judge Colby was reading the incorporation papers. I could see her taking in the details. The filing date, the managing member information, the lack of any substantive business purpose listed in the formation documents. Accompanying the incorporation records, I said are 14 months of bank statements from 3 different financial institutions, First Midwest Bank, Chase, and Wells Fargo. These statements document $187,000 in wire transfers from my accounts directly to Magnolia Events LLC. I placed another set of documents on the clerk's desk. Bank statements neatly organized by date, each transfer highlighted in yellow. Every single transfer, I said, was authorized by a forged signature on a wire transfer form. Not $1 of this money corresponds to any legitimate business service invoice, contract, or deliverable. Judge Colby looked up. Are you saying this company has no business operations at all? Correct, Your Honor. I've reviewed 14 months of bank records. Money comes in via wire transfer from my accounts. Money goes out via ATM withdrawals and cashback transactions at grocery stores, always under the federal reporting threshold. 14 months of statements. Not a single legitimate transaction, no vendor invoice, no payroll record, no evidence of any service rendered to anyone. The money came in through wire transfers and left through ATMs and cashback transactions, always in amounts designed to stay invisible. Roxanne's face had gone very still. The calculating expression was still there, but something behind it had shifted. Mr. Ridgway, Judge Colby said, turning to Preston, do you have a response to this? Preston stood. His expensive suit suddenly looked like it didn't fit quite right. Your Honor, he said, his voice careful now. I need a brief recess to confer with my clients regarding these unexpected... Motion denied, Judge Colby said. Your client initiated these proceedings. We'll finish them. Preston sat down slowly. $527,000. That's what they'd stolen from me across those 22 months. But it wasn't about the money. It never had been. It was about building a case so airtight that no lawyer, no matter how expensive, could make it disappear. Judge Colby was still reading the bank statements, her pen moving across her legal pad as she made notes. The courtroom had gone completely quiet. Even the court reporter had stopped typing, waiting for whatever came next. Mr. Merrick, Judge Colby said, finally looking up at me, given your extensive background as a federal investigator, I have to ask, why didn't you report these transactions immediately upon discovery? It was the question I'd been waiting for. The one that would make everything else make sense. Because, Your Honor, I said, my voice steady and clear, I needed the cumulative stolen amount to cross the federal statutory threshold for felony wire fraud. Under 18 U.S. Code Section 1343, wire fraud becomes a federal felony when the scheme affects interstate commerce and exceeds certain monetary thresholds. I paused, letting that sink in. More importantly, I continued, I required a sufficient number of documented transactions to legally establish pattern and intent, not just isolated opportunity or mistake. A single forged signature might be contested. A single wire transfer might be explained away. But 43 separate forgeries across 14 months, totaling over $500,000, funneled through a shell corporation with no legitimate business purpose. I looked directly at Preston. That's a pattern, that's intent, that's a federal case. And that, I said, took exactly 22 months to build properly. The air in courtroom 5B shifted, the particular stillness of a room full of people simultaneously revising what they thought they understood. Brent's face had gone from pale to gray. His hands were gripping the edge of the table so hard, his knuckles had turned white. I watched Preston's face in that moment. He was a good lawyer, good enough to understand immediately what I'd just said. He'd spent 3 months preparing to prove I was incompetent. He'd just realized he'd been walking into a federal trap the entire time. You've been conducting an investigation, Judge Colby said slowly, for 22 months. Yes, Your Honor. While your son was actively stealing from you? Yes, Your Honor. And you allowed it to continue? I documented it to continue, I corrected gently. There's a difference. I secured certified copies of every forged authorization. I cross-referenced every wire transfer with my actual bank records. I obtained the corporate formation documents. I hired Dr. Carmichael to conduct forensic analysis on every signature. I built the kind of case I would have built if I were still working federal investigations. I placed my hands flat on the table, the same worn oak surface I'd been sitting at for the past 2 hours, while Preston painted me as a confused old man. The only difference, I said, is that this time it was my own family I was building a case against. Preston was staring at me now, really seeing me for the first time all morning, not the frail widower in scuffed shoes, the 30-year FBI veteran who had testified in 47 federal trials. Your Honor, Preston said, his voice thin, I'd like to request. Sit down, Mr. Ridgway, Judge Colby said. He sat. The courtroom had gone absolutely silent. Brent was staring at me like he was seeing his father for the first time. Roxanne had gone perfectly still, that calculating expression frozen on her face. And Preston? Preston looked at his thick stack of legal briefs, then back at me, understanding finally settling in. His entire case was built on the premise that I couldn't manage my own affairs. I'd just proven I'd been managing a federal investigation, but I wasn't done yet, not even close. There was one more piece of Preston's foundation I needed to dismantle before I moved to the evidence that would break my son's heart. I reached into my briefcase and pulled out a smaller black folder separate from the financial documents. This one contained regulatory files, professional disciplinary actions, and federal case records. Your Honor, I said, I'd like to present the complete regulatory history of Dr. Clifford Bentley, the physician who signed the cognitive assessment that forms the foundation of this guardianship petition. Judge Colby looked up from the bank statements she'd been reviewing. Proceed. I placed the folder on the clerk's desk. In 2019, the Illinois Department of Financial and Professional Regulation suspended Dr. Bentley's medical license for systematic Medicare fraud. The federal investigation documented $1.2 million in fraudulent billing over a 3-year period. The clerk passed the folder to Judge Colby. I watched her open it, her expression shifting as she read the official suspension order. Dr. Bentley, continued, was billing Medicare for comprehensive neuropsychological evaluations that never occurred. He signed cognitive decline diagnoses for patients he'd never examined, enabling nursing facilities to bill for enhanced memory care services. Preston had gone very still in his chair. After his suspension, I said, Dr. Bentley attempted to continue practicing under a corporate name change. The state medical board denied the application and extended his suspension to 3 years. He was reinstated in March of 2022, 6 months before he signed my evaluation. Judge Colby was reading the disciplinary documents, now her pen moving across her legal pad, the federal case summary, the Medicare billing fraud details, the suspension order. I was the primary forensic accountant on the 2018 federal task force that investigated Dr. Bentley. I said quietly, I spent 8 months tracing fraudulent Medicare payments through his practice accounts. I testified before the state medical board about the financial patterns that proved systematic fraud rather than billing errors. I paused, letting that information settle. I recognized Dr. Bentley's signature the moment it was submitted this morning. Preston's face had drained of all color. Roxanne closed her eyes for just a second, a brief crack in her carefully maintained composure. I'd known Dr. Bentley's name for 7 years. I'd spent 8 months building the Medicare fraud case against him. When Preston submitted that evaluation this morning, I recognized the signature before I even read the diagnosis. Some names you don't forget. Your Honor, Preston said, his voice tight. I was not aware of Dr. Bentley's disciplinary history. The evaluation was provided by my clients. Who knew exactly who they were hiring, I said, because the evaluation is dated October 2023, 2 months ago. Dr. Bentley's suspension history is public record. A simple license verification search would have revealed it. Judge Colby looked at Preston. Did you verify the physician's credentials before submitting this evaluation as evidence? Preston opened his mouth, closed it. I relied on the documentation provided by my clients. Your clients, I said, selected a doctor whose license I personally helped suspend for falsifying the exact type of evaluation they needed to support this petition. The courtroom went silent. I reached into the inner pocket of my old suit jacket. My fingers found the envelope I'd been carrying there for 17 months. Worn, slightly yellowed at the edges, the paper soft from being handled too many times. Your Honor, I said, my voice steady despite the weight of what I was about to do. I wish to enter a letter written by my late wife, Lorraine Merrick, 6 weeks before her death from pancreatic cancer. I withdrew the envelope and held it for a moment. Lorraine's handwriting on the outside, for Leland, when you're ready. She composed it I said after overhearing a conversation between my son and his wife in the hallway outside her hospital room. Brent's head came up. His face had gone white. I walked the letter to the clerk's desk, then stepped back. Judge Colby opened it carefully, unfolding the single page of lined notebook paper covered in Lorraine's sloping handwriting. May I read the final paragraph aloud, Your Honor? I asked. She nodded. I took the letter back, my hands steady despite everything. I'd read these words 100 times, 1,000. They still cut like they were fresh. I read, Leland, I'm sorry I can't stay to protect you, so I'm leaving you this instead. The blue notebook is in the third drawer. You'll know what to do with it. You always did. Some things are worth fighting for, even when fighting hurts. Especially then. I love you. I'm proud of you. And I'm sorry our son forgot who you are. Love, Maggie. My voice didn't shake. 30 years of courtroom testimony had taught me how to read evidence without breaking. But my hands were gripping the letter hard enough to crease the edges. I folded it carefully and put it back in the envelope. Even the fluorescent lights had stopped their buzzing, or maybe I just couldn't hear them anymore. Even Roxanne, who hadn't shown a flicker of emotion all morning, had gone very still. My son had his hand over his face. I didn't look at him. Not yet. Judge Colby was watching me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Your Honor. I said my wife was 67 years old when she died. She'd been married to me for 42 years. She knew me better than anyone in the world. I paused. 6 weeks before she died, she spent her time documenting evidence instead of resting. She filled a notebook with dates and conversations and partial account numbers because she knew what was coming and she knew I'd need proof. I placed the letter on the clerk's desk. A woman with 42 years of marriage doesn't do that for someone suffering from cognitive decline. She does it for someone she trusts to finish what she started. Brent's shoulders were shaking now. His expensive navy suit suddenly looked like it was 2 sizes too big for him. He'd been holding himself together through the loan documents, through the shell company revelation, through the 22-month confession. But his mother's words she'd written while dying, knowing what he was planning, those broke him. Even Preston had gone quiet, watching his client fall apart. I wasn't finished yet, and neither was Lorraine. I gave my son 30 seconds to compose himself. Then I reached into my briefcase one more time and withdrew the blue cloth-covered notebook itself. It was small, the kind you'd use for grocery lists or daily reminders. The cloth cover was worn soft from being handled. 17 pages of lined paper, filled with Lorraine's careful, sloping handwriting. Your Honor, I said, walking it to the clerk's desk. This is the notebook my wife referenced in her letter. 17 pages, documenting what she observed and overheard during her final weeks. Judge Colby accepted it from the clerk and opened it carefully as though it were something fragile. Her fingers traced the first page. Page 1, I said, dated April 18th, 2022. Overheard B on phone in kitchen. Magnolia Events, wire transfer. Couldn't hear amount. Here. The judge turned to the second page. Page 2, April 23rd, R visited hospital. Asked how long doctors think I have. When I said maybe 8 weeks, she squeezed my hand and said, that's good enough time. I didn't understand then. Judge Colby looked up at me. Mr. Merrick, are you telling me your wife compiled these investigative notes from a terminal hospital bed? She was an accountant herself before she retired, Your Honor, I said. Worked for Morrison and Associates for 32 years. Forensic accounting, corporate fraud investigations. Old habits. The judge continued reading, turning pages slowly. I could see her taking in the entries. May 2nd, overheard hallway conversation outside room. R asked B about guardianship timeline. He said wait until after. She said make sure doctor is locked in. May 8th, be on phone again. Mentioned $40,000 transfer. Said keep it under 50, she knows the threshold. May 15th, ER told someone on phone the LLC account is at $380,000. Need to get house sold fast once guardianship goes through. 17 pages, 43 separate entries. Dates, times, fragments of conversation. My wife, dying in a hospital bed with 3 weeks left, had done what every good investigator does. First, she documented everything. While I was reading her medical charts and pretending we had time, she was building a case. Page 17, I said quietly. Her last entry, written 3 days before she died. L follow the LLC. Everything runs through the LLC. I love you. Judge Colby sat back in her chair, the notebook still open in her hands. The courtroom had gone absolutely silent. Brent still had his face in his hands. But Roxanne had shifted in her seat, leaning toward Preston. I saw her whisper something. Preston's head jerked toward her, listening. She whispered again, urgently this time. Preston nodded and rose to his feet. Your Honor, he said, his voice stronger now, more controlled than it had been for the past hour. While these allegations are certainly serious, I must point out that proving signature forgery is a complex legal process, requiring extensive expert analysis and cross-examination. He was recovering, getting his professional momentum back. A single forensic report, Preston continued, however detailed, is not conclusive evidence without the opportunity for independent verification and expert rebuttal. The defense is entitled to retain its own document examiner to conduct independent analysis, to cross-examine Dr. Carmichael's methodology. Roxanne handed him a folder. He opened it smoothly as though they'd rehearsed this. Furthermore, Your Honor, we have historical signature samples showing natural variation in Mr. Merrick's handwriting over the past decade. He pulled out several documents and approached the bench. Bank signature cards from 2015, 2018, and 2021. Authorization forms from various institutions, all showing consistent age-related variations in letter formation, pen pressure, and stroke consistency. Judge Colby accepted the documents and began reviewing them. These variations, Preston said, are consistent with normal changes in motor control associated with aging. They don't prove forgery. They prove that Mr. Merrick's signature has evolved over time exactly as one would expect. He was building reasonable doubt, creating a technical argument that would require time to resolve. Therefore, Preston said, I'm formally moving for an immediate continuance. These allegations are inflammatory and require proper expert response. We need time to review the defense's sudden filings, to retain our own forensic examiner to prepare appropriate responses. Roxanne was watching the judge now, her expression perfectly neutral, professional, calculated. Roxanne had prepared for this. Of course she had. She never walked into a room without knowing every exit, every contingency, every possible defense. That was the thing I'd always respected about her, even as I was building the case against her. She was very good at this, just not as good as me. Your Honor, Preston continued, rushing to judgment based on one-sided expert testimony and emotional appeals would be a miscarriage of justice. The court must allow proper time for... Mr. Ridgway, Judge Colby interrupted, still looking at the signature samples he'd provided. How long have you been representing the petitioners in this matter? Preston paused. 3 months, Your Honor. And when did they retain you? August of this year. So they had 3 months to prepare this petition, Judge Colby said. 3 months to gather their evidence, to obtain medical evaluations, to file their case. But now you need more time to respond to the defendant's evidence. Preston's jaw tightened. Your Honor, we weren't expecting... You weren't expecting Mr. Merrick to defend himself? Judge Colby asked. You filed a petition alleging he lacks the cognitive capacity to manage his affairs. Did you think he wouldn't respond? She set down the signature samples and picked up the blue notebook again. Motion for continuance is denied, she said. We'll proceed. Preston sat down slowly. Roxanne's expression didn't change, but I saw something shift behind her eyes. A recalculation, a reassessment of options. Judge Colby looked down at the signature variation samples Roxanne had prepared, then back at the blue notebook in her hands with Lorraine's handwriting documenting the conspiracy. She was weighing evidence, calculating credibility, doing exactly what judges do. Preston was already organizing his papers, trying to regroup. Roxanne was whispering to him again, probably planning their next argument. But they didn't know what I knew. They didn't know that 9 months ago they'd made a fatal mistake. They'd asked the wrong retired judge for advice. Judge Colby rapped her gavel and called for a 20-minute recess. I walked out into the marble corridor where Vaughn Gallagher was waiting. Vaughn was 54, former Chicago PD detective, my trusted friend for 20 years. He'd been sitting in the back of the courtroom gallery all morning, watching, observing, taking notes in that worn leather notebook he'd carried since his detective days. You knew from the beginning, didn't you? Vaughn said quietly as I approached. From before Lorraine even told you. I nodded. How long? 9 months, I said. February 2023. Vaughn let out a low whistle. Before she got sick. Before she even knew she was sick. I looked back through the courtroom doors. Brent was still at the defense table, his head in his hands. Preston was shuffling papers, trying to regroup. Roxanne sat perfectly still, her face a mask. Brent made a mistake, I said. He approached Oswald Thornton for conservatorship advice. Vaughn's eyebrows went up. Judge Thornton, Retired federal judge Oswald Thornton, I confirmed. 72 years old, sharp as ever, and a friend of mine for 30 years. I could still remember that phone call. February 14th, 2023. Valentine's Day. I'd been sitting in my home office going through tax documents. The phone rang at 8:30 in the evening. Leland, Oswald had said, his voice grave. I need to tell you something. Your son came to my office today. My hand had tightened on the phone. Brent? He was asking about guardianship procedures, how to establish conservatorship over an elderly parent, what kind of medical evidence he'd need, how long the process typically takes. I'd felt something cold settle in my chest. He didn't mention you by name, Oswald continued, but he said his father was 69, recently widowed. Your Lorraine passed last year, correct? Last June? I'd said quietly. Lorraine had been gone 8 months at that point. The house still smelled like her perfume. I was still sleeping on my half of the bed. Leland, I think you need to know exactly what kind of case he's building against you. I'd thanked Oswald and asked him to tell me everything Brent had said. Every question, every detail. Brent thought he was being careful, seeking informal advice from a respected retired judge before filing anything official. What he didn't know, what Roxanne apparently never thought to ask, was whether that judge might have connections to the man they were planning to erase. Oswald gave me the timeline. I told Vaughn now, standing in the courthouse corridor. Brent said he was planning to file in September. Alameda County Probate Court. He'd already talked to a lawyer, didn't mention Preston by name, but Oswald got the impression it was someone expensive. So you had 7 months, Vaughn said. 7 months to prepare, to understand what was coming, to build my own case. But you didn't tell Lorraine. I shook my head. Not at first. She was already dealing with the cancer diagnosis that came in March. I didn't want to add this on top of everything else. When did you tell her? I didn't, I said quietly. She figured it out on her own. Overheard that hallway conversation at the hospital in May. Started documenting everything in the blue notebook. I looked down at my scuffed Oxford shoes. 40 years old. Still holding together. When she showed me the notebook, I said I told her what Oswald had said, that I'd known since February. She just nodded and said, good. Then we have time to do this right. Vaughn was quiet for a moment. Then, what did you do after Oswald called? I called you, I said. Told you I needed phase 2 surveillance. Financial monitoring, Vaughn said. Following the bank accounts, documenting the wire transfers, and watching who they were meeting with, who they trusted, who they thought could help them. Vaughn's expression shifted, especially who Roxanne was meeting with. I nodded. Oswald had told me everything that night on the phone. Brent's questions about medical evaluations, his timeline for filing, his concern about making sure the evidence was solid enough that the court wouldn't question it. He's going to file in September, Oswald had said. Probably early September to have everything resolved before the holidays. He's already talked to a lawyer. He wants this done fast. I'd thanked Oswald and hung up. Sat in my home office for a long time looking at Lorraine's photo on my desk. Then I'd picked up the phone and called Vaughn. I need you to watch someone, I'd said. Who? My son and his wife. Vaughn hadn't asked questions. That was one of the things I valued about our friendship. He understood that if I was asking for surveillance on my own family, I had a reason. Phase 2, he'd said. Financial and personal. I need to know who they're meeting with, where they're going, who they trust. Oswald had told me he's going to file in September. He's already talked to a lawyer. I'd thanked Oswald and hung up. Then I'd called Vaughn and told him to start phase 2. That was 9 months ago. I'd been ready for this courtroom since February. Now, Vaughn looked at me with that expression I'd seen 100 times during our 20-year friendship. The look that said he'd found exactly what I'd asked him to find. Phase 2 wasn't just financial surveillance, I said. No, Vaughn confirmed. It was watching who Brent and Roxanne were meeting with, who they trusted, who they thought could help them. He pulled a manila envelope from his jacket pocket. Especially, I said quietly, who Roxanne was meeting with late at night when my son thought she was working. Vaughn handed me the envelope. I didn't open it. I knew what was inside. I'd seen the photographs 3 months ago when Vaughn first brought them to me. The judge will be calling us back in 5 minutes, I said, and I have photographs to introduce. When court reconvened at 1 o'clock, I called Vaughn Gallagher to the stand. He walked to the witness box with the steady confidence of someone who'd testified hundreds of times during his detective years. The court clerk administered the oath, and Vaughn placed his hand on the Bible. Mr. Gallagher, I said, please state your profession and your relationship to this case. Former Chicago Police Department detective, currently a licensed private investigator, Vaughn said. Mr. Merrick retained my services in February of 2023 to conduct surveillance related to potential financial fraud. I approached the witness stand with the manila envelope. What did that surveillance involve? Financial monitoring initially, Vaughn said, tracking bank accounts, documenting wire transfers. But in March, Mr. Merrick asked me to expand the scope to include personal surveillance of his son and daughter-in-law. Can you describe what you found? Vaughn opened the envelope and withdrew a stack of 8 by 10 photographs. Over 7 months, I documented multiple meetings between Mrs. Roxanne Fielding and attorney Preston Ridgway at non-professional locations. He held up the first photograph. June 3rd, 2023, an upscale restaurant downtown. 9:45 p.m. This photo shows Mrs. Fielding and Mr. Ridgway at a private corner table holding hands across the table. Preston's face had gone pale. Vaughn held up the second photograph. July 18th, 2023, a downtown hotel. 2:30 p.m. on a Wednesday afternoon. This photo shows Mrs. Fielding and Mr. Ridgway entering a hotel room together. They emerged 3 hours later. Roxanne's expression hadn't changed. She sat perfectly still, staring straight ahead. And the third location? I asked. Vaughn held up the final photograph. September 12th, 2023. The courthouse parking structure level 3, 6:15 p.m. This photograph captures what appears to be a heated argument between Mrs. Fielding and Mr. Ridgway. Body language suggests significant conflict. He set down the photographs and pulled out a folder. I also obtained copies of email correspondence between Mrs. Fielding and Mr. Ridgway. 37 emails sent via personal Gmail accounts rather than the law firm's secure servers. Judge Colby leaned forward. Personal email accounts? Yes, Your Honor. These emails explicitly discuss the conservatorship petition timeline and legal strategy. For example, this email from Mrs. Fielding to Mr. Ridgway, dated August 3rd, states, "We need to file before Thanksgiving. Make sure the medical evaluation is ironclad. L can't be allowed to challenge it." Vaughn passed the printed emails to the clerk, who handed them to Judge Colby. Another email, Vaughn continued, dated August 19th from Mr. Ridgway to Mrs. Fielding. "Bentley is on board. He'll sign whatever we need. B doesn't need to know the details." 7 months of surveillance, 14 documented meetings, 37 private emails sent through Gmail instead of the law firm's secure servers. Vaughn had done exactly what I'd asked him to do: follow the money and follow the people. He'd found both. I looked at Brent. He was staring at the photographs, now being passed around the courtroom. His expression was transforming from confusion to something raw and undeniable. Heartbreak, not the panic of an exposed criminal, not the fear of legal consequences, but the visceral, genuine devastation of a betrayed husband. He turned sharply toward Roxanne, his mouth opening as though to speak. She didn't look at him. She remained perfectly still, her gaze fixed somewhere above Judge Colby's head. Calculated detachment. "Mr. Gallagher," I said quietly, "based on your surveillance, what was the nature of the relationship between Mrs. Fielding and Mr. Ridgway?" "Romantic," Vaughn said simply. The photographs document physical affection, private hotel meetings, and email correspondence that goes beyond professional collaboration. In my professional opinion, they've been conducting an affair for at least 7 months, possibly longer. Brent made a sound, something between a gasp and a choked breath. Roxanne placed her hand deliberately on Brent's arm. The gesture looked reassuring to anyone watching, but I could see it for what it was: mechanical, strategic, the same way you'd steady a piece on a chessboard that was threatening to tip over. Brent looked down at her hand, then he looked at me across the courtroom. For the first time since this hearing began, I saw something in my son's face that wasn't rehearsed or calculated. It was the expression of someone realizing they'd been used. Judge Colby was reading through the emails, now her expression growing darker with each page. "Your Honor," Preston said, finally finding his voice. He stood his expensive suit suddenly looking rumpled. "These allegations they're completely inappropriate for these proceedings. My personal life has no bearing on—" "Your personal life," Judge Colby interrupted, looking up from the emails, "appears to include conducting a romantic relationship with your client's wife, while representing that client in a guardianship petition against his father. An arrangement that raises serious questions about conflict of interest and professional ethics." She held up one of the emails. "This correspondence discusses legal strategy using personal email accounts, explicitly references keeping information from your client, and suggests coordination with a medical professional to ensure testimony can't be challenged." Preston sat down. I watched my son's world crack in real time. Not because of me, not because of the evidence or the investigation or the courtroom. Because of her. I had expected to feel satisfaction in that moment. Instead, I felt something closer to grief. Brent was still looking at Roxanne's hand on his arm, that calculated, reassuring touch. I could see the exact moment he understood. His wife hadn't just helped him steal from his father. She'd been sleeping with their lawyer the entire time. While convincing Brent they were protecting their family's future. While holding his hand and telling him this was the right thing to do. The photographs were still being passed around the courtroom. The clerk was making copies of the emails for the record. Judge Colby was taking notes. But Brent had stopped looking at the evidence. He was staring at his father instead, and I had more witnesses waiting. My next witness was 71 years old, carrying a vintage handbag and about to play a recording that would prove everything. "I call Edith Sutton," I said. Edith Sutton had been Lorraine's closest friend for 15 years. She still lived next door to my house in the same gray bungalow with the rose garden Lorraine had helped her plant. She was 71, wearing a simple gray cardigan and sensible shoes, and she walked to the witness box with the careful steps of someone who'd had a hip replacement 2 years ago. The clerk administered the oath. Edith placed her hand on the Bible and promised to tell the truth. "Mrs. Sutton," I said, "can you describe what you overheard in March of this year?" Edith nodded, her hands folded neatly in her lap. "It was a Saturday afternoon, March 11th. I was in my backyard tending to the roses near the fence line that separates my property from yours." "What did you hear?" "Raised voices," Edith said. "Your son Brent and his wife Roxanne. They were in your backyard near the patio. They were arguing about timelines and filing papers. I heard Roxanne say something about needing to move faster, that they were running out of time." "Could you hear the conversation clearly?" "Some of it," Edith said. "Not everything. They were about 30 feet away and there was a breeze, but I heard enough to know they were discussing something about a legal filing, something about you." She paused, looking uncomfortable. "What happened next, Mrs. Sutton?" "I was concerned," Edith said. "Lorraine had been gone less than a year, and I knew you were still grieving. I wanted to call my daughter to ask her advice. She's a paralegal. But when I pulled out my phone to call her, I accidentally hit the wrong button." She reached into her vintage handbag and pulled out an old Samsung Galaxy phone, the kind with physical buttons on the front. "This is my old phone," she said. "I keep it charged for emergencies. When I went to call my daughter, I hit the voice recorder button instead of the phone button. I didn't realize it until later that evening when I was trying to make another call and saw the recording file." "Mrs. Sutton," I asked, "do you still possess that recording?" "Yes," she said, holding up the phone. "I brought it with me today." I approached the witness stand and accepted the phone from her hands. The screen showed a single audio file dated March 11th, 2023. Duration 4 minutes, 23 seconds. An old Samsung phone. 4 minutes and 23 seconds. Lorraine had given me the blue notebook with fragments of conversations. Edith was about to give the court the actual voices, captured in real time, saying exactly what they'd planned to do to me. I handed the phone to the bailiff. "Your Honor, I'd like to play this recording for the court." Judge Colby nodded. "Proceed." "Before I let you hear what that recording captured, I need to pause for a moment. Drop a comment below. Do you think my son knew exactly what he was doing, or do you think Roxanne manipulated him into it? I'll share my own answer at the end. Note what follows contains recreated dialogue for narrative impact. The bailiff connected the old Samsung phone to the courtroom speaker system. The room went silent as he pressed play. For a moment there was nothing but ambient noise, windbirds, the sound of someone moving. Then Roxanne's voice filled the courtroom, compressed and tinny from the phone's microphone, but absolutely clear. "The doctor's report is locked in. Ridgway filed the initial paperwork last week. We need to move before he figures it out." Brent's voice quieter, uncertain. "What if he fights it? What if Dad actually—" "4 million in real estate alone, Brent." Roxanne's voice was cold-focused. "This is what we agreed. He's not as sharp as he used to be. You said it yourself after Lorraine died. He's vulnerable now. We move in September before the holidays. Focus." A pause, the sound of footsteps on concrete. Then Brent's voice again, so quiet I almost missed it. "He's still my father." Roxanne's response was sharp. "And this is still $4 million. Stay focused on what matters. The money is already in motion. We can't back out now." More footsteps. The sound of a door opening and closing. Then static. The recording ended. The courtroom stayed silent for 5 full seconds. "He's still my father." 4 words. I hadn't expected to hear that. I hadn't expected it to matter so much. I kept my face very still. This was not the time to feel things. There would be time for that later, or there wouldn't be. Brent had his eyes closed. His jaw was clenched so tight I could see the muscle working beneath his skin. Roxanne sat perfectly still beside him, but I could see it now. That calculating expression was cracking at the edges. Preston had gone pale. He was staring at the phone like it was evidence in a murder trial, which in a way it was. Murder of trust. Murder of family. Judge Colby was writing notes, her pen moving quickly across her legal pad. "Mrs. Sutton," I said quietly, "did you tell anyone about this recording before today?" "I told you," Edith said. 3 weeks after Lorraine passed. I brought it to your house and played it for you. You asked me to keep the phone safe and not tell anyone else. And did you follow those instructions?" "Yes," Edith said. "The phone has been in my safe deposit box at the bank since June. I only retrieved it this morning." I thanked Edith and returned to my table. She stepped down from the witness box and walked back to her seat in the gallery. The recording ended with static, and the courtroom stayed silent for 5 full seconds. Brent had his eyes closed, his jaw clenched tight. Roxanne sat perfectly still, that calculating expression finally cracking at the edges. Even Preston had gone pale, realizing his clients had been recorded discussing their conspiracy in detail 8 months before filing. But I had one more witness who would make it impossible for anyone to claim this was just family drama. The silence after Edith's recording was the kind you feel in your chest. I watched Judge Colby remove her reading glasses and press 2 fingers against her temple. Preston Ridgway's entire posture had changed: shoulders hunched, neck rigid, like a man watching his fortress crumble 1 stone at a time. I adjusted the scuffed Oxford shoes beneath my chair and cleared my throat. "Your Honor," I said, rising slowly, "my next witness will demonstrate that this conspiracy extended beyond emotional manipulation and fraudulent documents. It crossed into federal criminal territory." Preston shot to his feet. "Objection. The plaintiff is attempting to—" "Overruled," Judge Colby said quietly. "I'll hear it. Call your witness, Mr. Merrick." I turned toward the gallery doors. The petitioner calls Special Agent Solene Prescott to the stand. The woman who entered wore a charcoal suit with an FBI credential clipped to her belt. Solene Prescott was 42 years old, a senior investigator with the Bureau's Financial Crimes Division, and according to Vaughn's background check, she'd spent the last 19 years building cases that sent white-collar criminals to federal prison. Her handshake was firm when we'd met 3 weeks earlier. Her testimony today would be devastating. After she was sworn in, I approached the witness stand with a manila folder. "Agent Prescott, can you tell the court how the FBI became aware of potential financial crimes connected to this guardianship case?" She opened her own folder, much thicker than mine. "On October 14th, 2023, our field office received a referral from your attorney, Mr. Gallagher, regarding suspicious offshore transactions. During our preliminary investigation, we discovered that evidence of these transactions had already been captured accidentally by a private citizen 1 week earlier. Can you explain that?" "Yes." She pulled out an enlarged photograph. "On October 12th, 2023, at approximately 3:47 p.m., a 17-year-old girl named Catalina Merrick was taking a screenshot of a recipe on her iPhone. The screenshot inadvertently captured a text notification at the top of her screen. I heard Brent inhale sharply from his seat. 2 rows behind him, I could see Catalina, my granddaughter, a high school senior with her mother's dark eyes and her father's stubborn chin staring at her hands. "What did that notification say?" Agent Prescott's voice remained clinical. The notification read, "Brandon M. confirmed $850,000 to Cayman, account cleared, September 28th, wire processed." The screenshot was sent to a group chat that included 3 of Catalina's friends. One of those friends forwarded it to her father, who happens to work in our Sacramento field office. The courtroom erupted. Judge Colby's gavel cracked 4 times. "Agent Prescott," I continued when order returned, "were you able to identify Brandon M.?" "Yes, Brandon Marcus Fielding, age 49. He's Roxanne Fielding's younger brother and the registered manager of Magnolia Events, LLC. I let that sit for 3 seconds. "And the Cayman account, registered to a shell corporation called Merrick Family Holdings, established in March 2023. Ms. Roxanne Fielding is listed as the sole beneficial owner." "Thank you, Agent Prescott." I returned to my table, feeling every one of my 69 years in my knees, but none of them in my resolve. No further questions. Preston's cross-examination lasted 4 minutes and accomplished nothing. You can't cross-examine bank records and federal wire transfer documentation. Judge Colby called a 15-minute recess at 2:08 p.m. I stayed in my seat, organizing my notes for the final witness. Vaughn went to make a phone call. The courtroom emptied slowly, people moving in that hushed way they do when they've witnessed something that changes the shape of a family forever. That's when I heard it. Brent's voice, low and urgent, coming from the hallway just outside the courtroom doors. I shouldn't have listened. But the father in me, the one who'd taught him to ride a bike, who'd sat in the hospital when Catalina was born, who'd believed for 63 years that blood meant something permanent, that father stood up and walked to the doorway. Brent was kneeling in the hallway, his expensive suit jacket bunched awkwardly around his shoulders. Catalina stood 3 feet away, her backpack clutched against her chest like armor. "Cat, please," Brent was saying, his voice cracked on her nickname. "I never wanted you to be part of this. I was trying to protect what?" Catalina's 17 years sharpened into something ancient and cold. "Your inheritance, Roxanne's real estate portfolio, because you definitely weren't protecting Grandpa. It's complicated. You don't understand what... I understand that Grandma died and you started stealing from Grandpa 6 months later." Her voice didn't rise. That's what made it unbearable. "I understand that you let your girlfriend's brother wire $850,000 to a Cayman Islands account. I understand that my friends saw that text before I did. And now everyone at school knows my dad is a criminal." Brent reached toward her. "Catalina," she stepped back. "I don't have a father anymore." Then she turned and walked down the hallway toward the elevator bank. Her footsteps echoed against the marble floors. Steady, final. The sound of a door closing that would never open again. Brent stayed on his knees. I watched his shoulders begin to shake, watched him press one hand against the floor, like he was trying to remember which way was up. Some part of me wanted to go to him, the same part that had bandaged his scraped knees and taught him to tie a necktie, and believed that parents and children were supposed to forgive each other everything. But I stayed where I was standing in the doorway, in my dead wife's scuffed Oxford shoes, and I let my son break apart in a courthouse hallway. Preston Ridgway found him there 2 minutes later, still on his knees, and for the first time in our entire case, I saw the lawyer look genuinely afraid. Preston got Brent back into his chair somehow, but my son looked like a shell. Whatever had broken in that hallway hadn't been fixed by the 15-minute recess. Brent sat with his shoulders curved inward, staring at his hands like they belonged to someone else. Judge Colby returned to the bench at 2:30 p.m. exactly. Her bailiff called the court to order. Preston Ridgway stood. His posture had recovered from the fear I'd seen in the hallway, replaced now with the rigid confidence of a man playing his last card. "Your Honor," he said, his voice steady, "I move to exclude both the recording presented by Mrs. Sutton and the testimony of Special Agent Prescott as unduly prejudicial and obtained through improper chain of custody. The accidental nature of both pieces of evidence raises serious questions about..." "Mr. Ridgway," Judge Colby's voice cut through his argument like a scalpel, "I've heard quite enough procedural objections for one afternoon." Preston's jaw tightened. "Your Honor, I must insist that..." "You may insist all you like." She leaned back in her chair, and I saw something shift in her expression. "But before I rule on your motion, I need to understand something about this case that has been bothering me since opening statements." She reached down beside her bench and lifted a thick hardcover book, blue binding, gold lettering on the spine. She placed it on the bench between her gavel and her water glass. I watched Preston's hands. They were steady on the table, but his jaw was working like he was chewing glass. "Mr. Merrick," Judge Colby said, looking directly at me, "would you please stand?" I rose slowly, feeling the Oxford shoes solid beneath my feet. Vaughn glanced at me from his seat, one eyebrow raised in question. I had no answers for him. "Please state your full name for the record." "Leland James Merrick." "And your occupation?" I hesitated. This wasn't standard procedure. Preston was watching me now, his earlier confidence fracturing into something uncertain. "I'm retired, Your Honor." "Retired from what specifically?" The courtroom had gone completely silent. Even the court reporter's fingers had paused above her keyboard. "I was a forensic accountant." "Where?" I understood then what she was doing. "Federal Bureau of Investigation, Financial Crimes Division." Preston's face drained of color. "How long did you serve?" 30 years, Your Honor. From 1985 to 2015. Judge Colby picked up the blue book and held it so the gallery could see the cover. "Following the Money, Forensic Accounting and Federal Investigations. 3rd edition." My name was printed below the title in smaller letters. "Mr. Merrick, I need the court to understand exactly who is bringing this petition." Please state your complete professional credentials for the record. Vaughn had told me this might happen. He'd warned me that my background could become relevant, that opposing counsel might try to use it against me, or that the judge might want it disclosed. I'd told him it didn't matter. The evidence spoke for itself. But standing there in my dead wife's Oxford shoes, watching Preston Ridgway's carefully constructed case collapse into rubble, I understood that it mattered very much. Leland James Merrick, I said clearly. Retired lead forensic accountant, Federal Bureau of Investigation, Financial Crimes Division. I served from September 1985 to June 2015. During that time, I was the primary investigator on 214 cases involving financial fraud, elder exploitation, wire fraud, money laundering, and asset concealment. I paused. Preston had gone completely still. I served as expert witness in 47 federal trials. 39 of those cases resulted in convictions. The remaining 8 ended in plea agreements before verdict. Roxanne had stopped whispering to Brent. She was staring at me like I'd grown a second head. I also authored Following the Money, Forensic Accounting in Federal Investigations, published by Oxford University Press in 2019. It is currently used as the standard textbook in forensic accounting programs at 17 universities and is part of the FBI Academy's financial crimes curriculum. Judge Colby set the book down gently. Thank you, Mr. Merrick. You may be seated. I sat. My knees cooperated barely. Preston's briefcase sat open beside him, angled so I could see inside from my table. There, wedged between a yellow legal pad and a manila folder, was the corner of a blue hardcover book. Following the Money, 3rd edition. I'd written that book after Lorraine's first cancer scare, when I'd thought about legacy and what I'd leave behind. I'd included case studies, methodology frameworks, and step-by-step guides for identifying fraudulent transactions. Chapter 7 was titled Guardianship Abuse, Recognizing the Patterns. Chapter 12 covered shell companies and offshore accounts. I'd written the blueprint. Preston had used it like a recipe. He saw me looking. His eyes followed mine down to his briefcase, to the blue spine visible between his papers. I watched the recognition hit him, watched his pupils dilate, watched the muscle in his temples start to pulse. The man had studied my book. He'd learned the techniques, identified the vulnerabilities, mapped out the exploitation strategies, and then he'd walked into a courtroom and tried to execute those exact schemes against the man who'd written the manual. The irony would have been funny if it weren't destroying my family. Preston reached down slowly and closed his briefcase. His hand was trembling, the first time I'd seen it shake in the entire trial. He set the leather case on the floor beside his chair, then placed both palms flat on the table like he was trying to hold himself upright. Judge Colby was watching him with something that might have been pity. Your motion to exclude evidence is denied, Mr. Ridgway, she said quietly. We'll take a 10-minute recess before closing arguments. Her gavel fell once. The closing arguments would begin in 10 minutes. The 10-minute recess passed in a blur of whispered conversations and nervous energy. When Judge Colby returned to the bench at 2:40 p.m., the courtroom felt tighter somehow, like the walls had moved closer during the break. Emma was halfway to her feet when the courtroom doors opened and 2 federal agents walked in. Not just any agents. Special Agent Solene Prescott, who'd testified an hour earlier, and a second agent I didn't recognize, tall mid-40s, the kind of bearing that came from years of walking into hostile rooms with nothing but a badge and a warrant. Prescott approached the bench directly. She carried a manila envelope with a red seal across the flap. Your Honor, she said, I apologize for the interruption, but I have a sealed warrant signed this morning by Federal Magistrate Judge Caldwell authorizing immediate action in this matter. Judge Colby's expression didn't change, but I saw her shoulders straighten. Approach. Emma Preston and Agent Prescott moved to the bench. Vaughn glanced at me with raised eyebrows. I had no idea what was coming, but 30 years of investigative work had taught me to recognize the particular gravity that preceded federal intervention. Judge Colby broke the seal and read the document in complete silence. The only sound in the courtroom was the ventilation system and someone's nervous breathing 3 rows behind me. I felt something shift in my chest, watching the agent stand there, solid and immovable as granite. 30 years I'd chased money through shell companies and offshore accounts, building cases 1 wire transfer at a time, watching criminals think they were smarter than the system. And here it was happening in real time, not as the investigator, but as the victim whose evidence had triggered the machine I used to be part of. Judge Colby set the warrant down carefully. Mr. Ridgway, Ms. Larkin, step back, please. They returned to their tables. Preston's face had gone the color of old newspaper. Agent Prescott, Judge Colby said, her voice carrying to every corner of the courtroom, please state for the record the nature of the warrant. Prescott turned to face the gallery. Your Honor, pursuant to Title 18 United States Code Section 981, the United States District Court for the Northern District of California has issued an emergency asset seizure and account freeze order. All financial accounts, real property and business holdings associated with Magnolia Events LLC, Brandon Marcus Fielding, and Brent Andrew Merrick are now under federal hold, pending criminal investigation into wire fraud, elder financial exploitation, and money laundering. The courtroom erupted. Judge Colby's gavel came down hard, 3 sharp cracks that echoed like gunshots. The freeze is effective immediately, Prescott continued when silence returned. All parties named in the warrant are prohibited from accessing, transferring, or disposing of any assets pending federal review. I watched Roxanne's face. Nothing moved. Not a muscle, not a flicker of surprise. She sat perfectly still, hands folded on the table while the world collapsed around her. Brent had stopped breathing. I could see it from across the aisle, his chest frozen mid-inhale, his eyes fixed on some point in the middle distance where his entire future used to be. Preston shot to his feet. Your Honor, I move for an emergency continuance to allow my client's time to— Motion denied, Mr. Ridgway. Judge Colby's voice was granite. Federal criminal proceedings take precedence over state civil matters. This court has no authority to delay or interfere with a federal warrant. But, Your Honor, denied. The word fell like a tombstone. Preston stood there for 5 seconds, his hand still raised mid-gesture. Then he lowered it slowly and turned to look at Roxanne and Brent. Something passed across his face. Calculation, survival instinct, the cold mathematics of self-preservation. He straightened his tie. Your Honor, he said, his voice carefully controlled, I must disclose to the court that I have been materially misled by my clients regarding the authenticity of documents presented in this matter. Vaughn's hand gripped my forearm under the table. Preston continued, each word precise as a scalpel. Based on testimony and evidence presented today, I now have reason to believe that I was retained under false pretenses and that my clients provided fraudulent documentation to support their guardianship petition. Brent made a sound low, strangled, barely human. As an officer of this court, Preston said, I have an ethical obligation to preserve the integrity of these proceedings and my professional license. Therefore, I hereby withdraw from representation of Roxanne Fielding and Brent Merrick, effective immediately. He paused, letting that sink in. I will fully cooperate with federal investigators regarding any information obtained during the course of my representation within the bounds of attorney-client privilege as it applies to communications made in furtherance of fraud, the exception that devoured the rule. If the client used the lawyer to commit fraud, privilege vanished like smoke. Preston didn't look at Brent, not once. He gathered his files with the same methodical precision he'd shown all day. Yellow legal pad manila folders, the blue forensic accounting textbook he'd tried to hide. He stacked them in his briefcase like he was packing up after any ordinary motion hearing. Roxanne watched him with eyes like frozen lakes. Preston closed his briefcase, both latches. This time, no trembling hands, and addressed the bench one final time. Your Honor, I will file formal notice of withdrawal within 24 hours and will be available to the court should any questions arise regarding my prior representation. So noted, Judge Colby said quietly. Preston picked up his briefcase and walked toward the courtroom doors. His footsteps on the marble floor were steady, unhurried, the sound of a man who'd made his choice and would sleep fine tonight. The doors closed behind him with a soft click. Brent was shaking, his whole body trembling like he was freezing to death in the overheated courtroom. He reached toward the empty chair where his lawyer had been sitting 30 seconds earlier, his hand hovering in the air above nothing. Roxanne's face showed nothing. She watched Preston abandon her with the same expression she'd had all morning, not frozen but controlled the way a surgeon looks when the procedure goes wrong. But the hands keep moving anyway. She'd been preparing for this moment. The courtroom waited to see what she would do without her lawyer. Agent Prescott stood before Judge Colby could ask Roxanne about representation. Your Honor, Prescott said, her voice cutting through the stunned silence Preston had left behind. The Bureau has uncovered evidence that this is not Ms. Fielding's first guardianship exploitation scheme. Roxanne didn't move. She sat perfectly still at the defendant's table, alone. Now her hands folded with the same precise composure she'd maintained through 3 days of testimony. But I saw something flicker behind her eyes, not surprise, but calculation. The look of someone mentally reviewing contingency plans filed under Z. Judge Colby leaned forward. Proceed. Prescott opened a thin folder. Indianapolis, Indiana, March 2013. A guardianship petition was filed against Harold Benjamin Kensington, age 72, retired postal worker, widowed 18 months prior. Mr. Kensington had no children, no living siblings, and his closest relatives were cousins in Oregon who'd lost touch decades earlier. I felt the courtroom shift. This wasn't about our family anymore. The petitioner, Prescott continued, was a woman named Rachel Thornton who claimed to be Mr. Kensington's neighbor and concerned friend. She presented medical evaluations from a Dr. Marcus Bentley. Wait, Judge Colby's hand went up. The same Dr. Bentley who testified in this case. No, Your Honor. Different person, same surname. But the pattern is identical. The petition alleged diminished capacity, appointed a guardian, and within 4 months had liquidated Mr. Kensington's home, his retirement accounts, and transferred the proceeds to a shell company called Magnolia Properties, LLC. Magnolia, the same name she'd used here, just swapped properties for events. I watched my son's face as he listened. The color drained from his cheeks like someone had opened a valve. He turned slowly to look at the woman sitting 18 inches to his left. The woman he'd married, the woman who'd shared his bed, for God knew how long, the mother of his strategies, if not his child. Rachel Thornton, Prescott said, and I heard the hammer coming down before she swung it, was an alias. Facial recognition software and fingerprint analysis confirmed that Rachel Thornton was Roxanne Marie Fielding. The courtroom erupted. Judge Colby's gavel cracked twice. Brent made a sound, half gasp, half sob. No, he whispered. No, that's not... But Prescott wasn't finished. The only significant difference between the Indianapolis case and this one, Your Honor, is that Harold Kensington died 6 months into the guardianship. Pneumonia according to the death certificate. His Oregon cousins were located 8 months later during estate proceedings, but by then the assets were gone. No charges were ever filed because investigators couldn't prove the medical evaluation was fraudulent. Roxanne met my eyes across the courtroom aisle. She held my gaze for 3 full seconds. No apology, no fear, no acknowledgement of anything except the fact that she'd underestimated me. She'd done this before. She'd identified a vulnerable old man with no family, isolated him, stripped him of everything, and walked away clean when he died. And then she'd found another one. Me. Except I wasn't alone. I had Brent, and Lorraine had made sure I knew what was coming. Your Honor, Prescott said, the Bureau is preparing federal charges against Ms. Fielding for both the Indianapolis case and the current matter. We're also investigating 2 additional potential victims in Phoenix and Sacramento. 4 victims, maybe more. Judge Colby set down her pen with careful precision. Ms. Fielding, do you wish to respond to these allegations? Roxanne opened her mouth. Brent stood up. The movement was so sudden, so violent, that his chair scraped backward across the floor with a sound like a scream. Roxanne reached for his arm, a small gesture proprietary the way you'd touch someone you owned. He jerked away from her like she was fire. Your Honor, Brent said, and his voice shook but held, I wish to formally request a cooperation agreement with federal prosecutors. The courtroom went dead silent. Vaughn's hand found my shoulder and squeezed once. Emma had gone completely still at our table, pen frozen mid-note. Brent reached into his jacket pocket. The USB drive was small black, no bigger than his thumb. 18 months of conspiracy reduced to 4 gigabytes of data. I have an encrypted drive, Brent said, holding it up so Judge Colby could see, containing complete email and text message correspondences between myself, Brandon Fielding, and Roxanne detailing the planned asset liquidation, every transfer instruction, every shell company formation document, every discussion about moving the money offshore. Roxanne's composure finally cracked. Brent, don't. I kept copies, he said louder now, talking over her. Everything, every conversation about moving the money, every transfer instruction, every lie we told. I encrypted it and stored it in 3 separate locations because, his voice broke, because some part of me knew this was wrong. Some part of me knew exactly what we were doing to him. Him, not my father, not Leland, just him. The old man in the scuffed Oxford shoes who'd taught him to ride a bike and tie a necktie, and thought that blood meant something permanent. Brent turned and looked at me directly. For the first time in the entire trial, maybe the first time in 2 years, my son looked me in the eye. Really looked. No evasion, no excuses, no careful lawyer-coached neutrality, just grief, raw and complete and devastating. I didn't know what to do with my hands. Didn't know if I should stand or speak or reach across the aisle that separated us like a canyon. 30 years of FBI training hadn't prepared me for this, for watching my son choose between the woman who'd manipulated him and the father he'd betrayed. He chose Agent Prescott, Brent said, still holding my gaze. I'll provide full access to the encrypted files and testify to the authenticity of every document. I'll answer any questions about the timeline, the planning, the execution. His voice failed completely. I'll tell you everything, he whispered. Brent held my gaze for 3 full seconds. His eyes were wet, but he didn't blink. We didn't say anything. There was nothing left to say that hadn't already been destroyed or saved in the same moment. Judge Colby reached for the USB drive, and I felt the final pieces of our family fall into place. Judge Colby set the USB drive down and looked at Roxanne for a long moment before speaking. Ms. Fielding, she said quietly, do you understand that you are now without legal representation and face serious federal criminal charges? Roxanne met the judge's gaze without flinching. I understand, Your Honor. Do you wish to request court-appointed counsel? That won't be necessary. Judge Colby nodded once, then looked toward Agent Prescott. Proceed. Prescott approached the defense table with her partner. Roxanne remained seated, hands folded back, straight, not frozen but controlled the way a surgeon looks when the procedure goes wrong. But the hands keep moving anyway. Roxanne Marie Fielding, you are under arrest for wire fraud, conspiracy to commit elder financial exploitation, and falsification of legal documents. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. You have the right to an attorney. If you cannot afford an attorney, one will be provided for you. Roxanne listened without expression. When Prescott finished, she turned her head and looked directly at me. Not at Brent, not at the judge or the gallery full of witnesses. At me. Her eyes traveled down to my feet, to the scuffed brown Oxford shoes, resoled twice the leather soft from nearly 40 years of walking into courtrooms and crime scenes. The shoes Lorraine had pressed into my hands outside the Chicago field office on my first morning at the FBI. Those shoes, Roxanne said, her voice almost conversational, are older than our marriage. They are, I said. She stood gracefully and extended her wrist toward Agent Prescott. The handcuffs clicked into place. No tears, no protests, no desperate final words, just the chilling composure of someone who had practiced walking away from wreckage before. The agents led her toward the courtroom doors. She didn't look back. Judge Colby waited until the doors closed. Mr. Merrick, she said, the petition for guardianship is denied in its entirety. I find no evidence whatsoever of diminished capacity, cognitive decline, or inability to manage your own affairs. This court hereby grants you full unrestricted legal authority over all your affairs and assets. Your autonomy and legal capacity are fully restored. 22 months, gone in 3 sentences. Your forensic accounting work, Judge Colby added, and something close to a smile touched the corner of her mouth, is even more impressive in practice than it reads on the page. My wife edited every word, I said. She'd be pleased to hear that, Your Honor. Then she had excellent judgment in more than one area of her life. Her gavel came down once final and absolute. This matter is concluded. Vaughn squeezed my shoulder. Emma Larkin was crying quietly beside me. I sat perfectly still and felt Lorraine's absence like a physical weight pressing down on the victory. We'd won. She'd prepared me to win, but she wasn't here to see it. I walked out of courtroom 5B at 3:35 p.m. victorious and alone. The third-floor hallway was quieter than the courtroom. Catalina sat on a wooden bench near the elevator bank, algebra homework spread across her lap, her backpack pressed against her side like something she needed to hold on to. She looked up when she saw me, her expression caught somewhere between hope and dread. Grandpa, where's Dad? I bent down slowly and helped her gather the papers that scattered when she stood. Her textbook was open to page 147. 3 problems completed while waiting for her family to be destroyed. Catalina, I said, keeping my voice steady, I need you to be brave right now. Her face went pale. What happened? Your dad made serious mistakes. He's cooperating with federal investigators. That matters. It means he's choosing to make things right, but he'll still face criminal charges. And Roxanne, arrested, federal custody pending trial. She sat back down hard. Her hands were shaking. I watched her piece the timeline together, the parts she'd always known somewhere underneath, the parts she'd refused to look at directly. My screenshot, she whispered, the one I sent Maya from her mom's phone in October. Brandon's text about the Cayman account. Maya's dad works for the FBI. Catalina, I helped put them both in prison. She looked up at me with Lorraine's eyes carrying something too heavy for 17 years. Because I was taking a picture of a recipe, I wanted to. We got into my car without speaking, and I pulled out of the courthouse parking garage into late afternoon traffic. My 2011 Buick LaCrosse still ran smooth after 12 years and 140,000 miles. Lorraine had picked the color silver with gray interior. She'd said it looked dignified. Catalina sat in the passenger seat with her algebra textbook in her lap unopened. She stared out the window as I merged onto I-580 eastbound toward Oakland. The highway was crowded with Friday commuters heading home to lives that hadn't just imploded in a courthouse. We drove in silence. 10 minutes, 15, 20. The sun was setting behind the Oakland hills, turning everything gold and shadow. Traffic moved slow and steady around us. Brake lights flaring red in waves as people tapped their pedals and checked their phones and thought about dinner. Normal Friday things. Things that felt like they belonged to a different universe than the one Catalina and I were occupying. She shifted in her seat, and I heard her take a breath like she was preparing to dive underwater. Grandpa, her voice was small, were you scared during all of this? I kept my eyes on the road on the Camry 3 car lengths ahead with a fading Obama bumper sticker. 30 years of FBI training had taught me how to lie convincingly when the mission required it. But this wasn't a mission, and Catalina deserved better than bureau deflection. Every day, sweetheart, I said. Every single day for 22 months. She turned to look at me. I felt her stare like pressure against the side of my face. But you always seemed so calm, like you knew exactly what you were doing. That was practice. I took the off-ramp toward our exit, the one I'd driven 10,000 times with Lorraine in the same passenger seat. 30 years of walking into situations where showing fear would get people hurt. You learned to keep it inside. What were you most scared of? I pulled up to the stoplight at Grand Avenue. The intersection looked exactly the same as it had this morning, but everything felt different. Victory was supposed to feel cleaner than this. I was most scared that the evidence wouldn't be enough, I said quietly. That I wouldn't be able to protect you from what they were doing. That Brent and Roxanne would succeed, and you'd lose your grandfather to a legal fiction while I was still breathing. The light turned green. I drove through it. And I was scared. I continued, the words coming easier now, that even if I won, you'd be caught in the crossfire. That protecting myself would mean destroying your family. You didn't destroy it, Catalina said. Her voice cracked. They did. I know, but that doesn't make it hurt less for you. She was crying again, quiet tears that ran down her face without sound. I reached over and took her hand. Her fingers gripped mine so tight it hurt. We're going to be okay, I said, even though I wasn't sure either of us believed it yet. It's going to take time, but we're going to be okay. We drove the rest of the way home in silence, but her hand stayed in mine. 3 weeks later, I sat in my home office on a Tuesday afternoon in late November, reading an email from Special Agent Solene Prescott. The subject line read, Case Status Update, Merrick Investigation. I printed it out before reading Old Habit, from decades of building paper trails that couldn't be deleted or altered. The printer hummed and clicked, and I filed the pages in the accordion folder I'd been maintaining since May 2022, tab 17, Federal Criminal Proceedings. I was still thinking like an investigator, still organizing evidence, even though the investigation was over. The update was thorough, clinical, the kind of precise summary that turned human catastrophe into bullet points. Brent Andrew Merrick had signed a federal plea and cooperation agreement on November 15th, 2023. In exchange for full testimony against Roxanne Fielding and Brandon Marcus Fielding, he would face reduced sentencing on charges of conspiracy to commit wire fraud and elder financial exploitation. Sentencing hearings scheduled for March 2024. Estimated range 18 to 36 months. Federal prison followed by supervised release. Roxanne Marie Fielding faced federal indictment on 17 counts, including wire fraud, conspiracy to commit elder financial exploitation, money laundering, falsification of legal documents, and perjury. Trial scheduled for April 2024 in the United States District Court for the Northern District of California. If convicted on all counts, she faced up to 45 years in federal prison. Brandon Marcus Fielding had been indicted on 12 counts related to the offshore account transfers and shell company operations. He'd refused cooperation and was proceeding to trial alongside Roxanne. Dr. Clifford Bentley, the psychiatrist who'd evaluated me and declared me cognitively impaired, had been charged with perjury and conspiracy. He'd also lost his medical license pending investigation by the California Medical Board. Preston Ridgway faced state bar disbarment proceedings for ethical violations related to presenting fraudulent documents and failing to conduct adequate due diligence on client representations. Magnolia Events LLC had been officially dissolved, its assets seized and liquidated by federal order. All funds stolen from my accounts, the full amount plus interest calculated at the federal judgment rate, had been restored. The money sat in my bank account like it had never left, like the last 22 months had been a bad dream I could wake up from. Except Catalina was still living in my guest bedroom because her parents were both facing federal prison time, and waking up didn't change that. I set Agent Prescott's email down and looked out the window. My neighborhood looked the same as it had before all this started. Same houses, same trees losing their leaves for winter, same mail truck making its afternoon rounds. But I was different. Catalina was different. Brent was different in ways I couldn't fully comprehend yet. The legal machinery was grinding forward with federal precision. Indictments filed, trial dates set, cooperation agreements signed, justice moving at the speed of bureaucracy and due process. But Catalina still wasn't sleeping through the night, and I could hear her crying through the wall at 2 a.m. I'd lie awake in my own bed, the one I'd shared with Lorraine for 43 years before she died, and listen to my granddaughter grieve for parents who were still alive but already gone. Justice was coming. The system was working. The evidence I'd gathered, the case Vaughn had built, the testimony Emma had orchestrated, all of it was producing exactly the outcome it was designed to produce. But healing would take longer. The doorbell rang at 7:30 on a Thursday in early December, and I knew who it was before I looked through the peephole. Brent stood on my front porch in a jacket too thin for the weather, hands shoved in his pockets. Behind him, Christmas lights blinked red and green across the neighbor's lawn. He looked up at the peephole like he knew I was watching. I opened the door but didn't step back to let him in. "Hello," he said. "Brent?" He looked different than he had in the courtroom. Thinner, older, carrying exhaustion that comes from weeks of not sleeping right. My son looked 10 years older than he had in November. Federal detention does that, or maybe it was just the weight of everything finally landing. "The guilty plea hearing is next Thursday," he said. "I know. Vaughn told you." Agent Prescott sent an update. He nodded, looking down at his shoes. Expensive running shoes that probably cost $200. The kind you bought when money felt permanent. "I just wanted you to, He stopped. Started again. "I thought you should," but whatever he'd come to say wouldn't form into words. Maybe there were no words for it. No sentence that could cross the distance between what he'd done and where we stood now. The silence stretched out. December wind moved through the oak tree I'd planted when Brent was 5. He'd helped me dig the hole, small hands gripping a plastic shovel while Lorraine took photos. "I can't..." Brent's voice cracked. "There's nothing I can say that would..." "No," I agreed quietly. "There isn't." He looked up at me then, and I saw something I hadn't seen in the courtroom. Not defiance or calculation or careful neutrality, just my son breaking apart in pieces too small to glue back together. I opened the door a few inches wider. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't absolution or reconciliation or any of the things that would need years to build and might never arrive. It was just a door opening slightly wider on a cold Thursday night, a gesture too small to name but too important to ignore. Brent saw it. His shoulders dropped half an inch, and he nodded once. "Okay," he whispered. Then he turned and walked to his car, a rental I noticed. He got in without looking back, and I stood in the doorway until his taillights disappeared. Catalina was watching from the stairs when I came inside. "Was that Dad?" she asked. "Yes." "What did he want?" I looked at her, and Lorraine's old bathrobe homework spread across her lap. "I don't think he knew," I said. 2 weeks later, mid-December, Catalina officially moved her belongings into Brent's childhood bedroom. We'd been calling it the guest room, but pretending it was temporary hadn't been helping. "You can change anything you want," I told her as she unpacked. Paint the walls, move furniture, whatever makes it feel like yours. She hung clothes in the closet next to Brent's old Letterman jacket I'd never had the heart to throw away. Her life fitting into the spaces her father had left behind. What's this? She lifted a framed photograph from the bookshelf. Brent, at 10 years old, gap-toothed and sunburned, holding up a tiny vase. I stood beside him in the photo, younger than I could remember, being wearing a fishing hat Lorraine had bought me as a joke. Lake Shasta, I said, 1996. That was his first fish. Is this Dad? He looks so young. He was young. She studied the photo for a long time, fingers tracing the edge of the frame. Was he a good dad? She asked quietly. When I was little before all this, the question landed in my chest like a stone. Yes, I said, because it was true. He was a very good dad to you for the first 14 years. And then Roxanne happened. And then a lot of things happened that he chose badly about. She set the photo on the nightstand beside the bed that was now hers. We both looked at it, young Brent, frozen at 10 before he knew what his life would become, before he'd have to choose between right and easy. Do you think that's enough? Catalina asked. 14 good years out of 17. I don't know, sweetheart. That's something you'll have to figure out for yourself. On a cold Friday in late December, Catalina asked if she could visit Brent at the federal holding facility. I drove her there and waited in the parking lot, watching families come and go through security checkpoints. 45 minutes later, she came back out. Her eyes were red, but she wasn't crying. How was it? I asked as she buckled her seatbelt. Weird. She stared out the windshield. He looks different in the orange jumpsuit. I started the car but didn't pull out yet. He said he's sorry, Catalina continued. For all of it. For lying, for stealing from you, or dragging me into it, for destroying our family. Forgiveness isn't a door you open all at once. Sometimes it's just turning the lock. One click, seeing if the hinges still work, checking whether the frame can hold weight again. What did you say? I said okay. I looked at her. Just okay? I didn't say it was okay. I just said okay. Like I hear you. I acknowledge that you said words. She turned to face me. Is that bad? Should I have said I forgive him? No, I said, feeling something in my chest ease slightly. That was exactly right. You told him the truth instead of what he wanted to hear. He has the fishing picture on his desk, she added, the one from my room. He said he looks at it every day to remember who he used to be. We drove home in silence that felt different than the silence from November. Lighter, maybe, or just less sharp. That night I found a duplicate of the fishing photo in the attic, tucked in a box of old albums. I put it in my desk drawer next to Lorraine's blue notebook and the accordion folder of evidence I couldn't quite bring myself to file away yet. Some things you carry in your pocket, and some things you carry in a drawer, and some things you carry without opening them yet. The old shoes still fit, and that had to be enough for now. Christmas Eve arrived quiet and cold, and I found myself standing in the winter garden where Lorraine used to plant roses. The beds were empty now, just frost-covered earth and the bare stems she'd pruned back in October before she got too sick to work in the yard. I'd kept them watered through the summer, but I didn't know enough about roses to do more than that. The old Oxford shoes crunched on the frozen grass. Leland, I turned. Edith Sutton stood at the garden gate, wearing a thick wool coat and carrying a foil-covered casserole dish that steamed in the cold air. Edith, come in. She walked over and stood beside me, looking down at the empty rose beds. We'd been neighbors for 37 years. She'd held Lorraine's hand during the bad days at the end. She'd testified in that courtroom and played an accidental recording that helped save everything Lorraine and I had built. I'm making too much food for one person tomorrow, she said. I was hoping you and Catalina might come for Christmas dinner. We'd like that. Thank you. We stood in comfortable silence, watching the winter garden prepare for spring. We couldn't see yet. The rose beds were bare sticks now, but Lorraine always said dormant wasn't the same as dead. Spring would come. It always did if you waited long enough and kept the roots alive. Lorraine would be so proud of you, Leland, Edith said quietly. I felt something tighten in my chest. She's the one who started all of this. She left those instructions, told me to fight if something happened. The blue notebook, the evidence folders, everything. I know. She told me about it near the end. Made me promise to help if you needed me. Then she's the one who deserves the credit. Edith turned to look at me, and her expression was gentle but firm. You did what she asked, but you chose to stand up. There's a difference, Leland. She gave you the tools, but you picked them up and fought with them for 22 months. That was your choice, your strength. I looked down at the scuffed brown leather on my feet. Nearly 40 years old, resoled twice the leather soft and creased like old hands that had worked hard and earned their rest. I wore these shoes to the FBI Academy in 1985, I said. Lorraine gave them to me the morning I started, said they looked dignified. Edith smiled. They did their job, didn't they? Yes, I said. They did. Christmas morning came early the way it always does when you have a teenager in the house. Catalina made coffee while I started breakfast, and we settled into the living room with the small tree she'd insisted we put up. Just a 4-footer from the grocery store parking lot, but she'd decorated it with ornaments she'd found in the attic, some of them from when Brent was little. This one's for you, she said, handing me a wrapped box. Open it first. The paper was silver with snowflakes. I unwrapped it carefully and opened the box. Brown Oxford shoes, new unworn, the exact same model as the pair on my feet. The leather was stiff and unbroken, the soles pristine, the laces still factory straight. Catalina, the old ones did their job, Grandpa, she said. All those miles, all those courtrooms, all those years, time to start fresh. I lifted one of the new shoes from the box. It was perfect. The same dignified brown Lorraine had picked out in 1985, the same classic Oxford style that never went out of fashion because it never tried to be fashionable in the first place. These are... My voice caught. Catalina, these are perfect. I looked up the brand online, tracked down the same model. Took me 3 weeks to find them. I set the shoe down carefully and pulled her into a hug. She held on tight, and I felt her shoulders shake with quiet tears that weren't quite sad and weren't quite happy, but were something more complicated than either. Thank you, I whispered into her hair. But when we pulled apart and she went to make hot chocolate, I set the new shoes aside and slipped on the old familiar pair. The leather knew the shape of my feet. The soles knew my weight and gait. They'd carried me through a courthouse and a courtroom and 22 months of fighting for what mattered. I'll wear them New Year's Eve, I promised when Catalina came back and saw the old shoes still on my feet. I promise. She smiled. Okay, Grandpa. December 31st arrived cold and clear. At 11:58 p.m., I sat in the living room wearing the new shoes. The leather was stiff, the fit not quite broken in yet, but they were dignified and solid, and ready for whatever miles were coming. Catalina noticed immediately when she came downstairs from brushing her teeth. You kept your promise, she said, looking at my feet. The new shoes. I always keep my promises to you. She sat beside me on the couch, and we watched the clock tick toward midnight. Outside the window, I could see the winter garden, the bare rose beds waiting patiently for spring. I looked down at the new shoes, brown Oxford leather 0 miles, unscuffed and unmarked. The old ones sat in my closet upstairs, honored and retired, but not discarded. Both mattered. Both had carried weight. Happy New Year, Grandpa, Catalina said as the clock struck 12. Happy New Year, sweetheart. In my mind, I added quietly, Happy New Year, Maggie. We made it. The old shoes had carried me through 22 months of fighting for what Lorraine and I built together. Through courtrooms and testimony and evidence folders, and the long midnight hours when I'd wondered if any of it would be enough. They'd walked me through the worst thing that ever happened to our family and brought me out the other side still standing. The new shoes would carry me forward with Catalina into whatever came next. New schools and new routines, and the slow work of building a life from the pieces of the old one. Spring would come to the rose garden. Healing would come in its own time. Justice had already arrived, patient and federal and final. Sometimes you stand up in old shoes, sometimes in new ones. Sometimes you fight in scuffed leather that's seen 40 years of miles. And sometimes you start fresh with clean souls and unmarked paths ahead. What matters is what you're willing to stand for, no matter how long it takes. And to you listening to my story, remember this. For 22 months, I wore the same Oxford shoes Lorraine gave me nearly 40 years ago. I could have given up when my own son testified against me, believed I was too old to fight back. But Lorraine taught me that dormant isn't the same as dead. Spring always comes if you keep the roots alive. This isn't just a story about father revenge against those who wronged me. It's about knowing when to stand up, even when the people hurting you are the ones you love most. I believe God gave me 30 years at the FBI for a reason, to prepare me for defending what matters. A father's revenge isn't always anger. Sometimes it's about justice, using every skill you have to protect what's sacred. The old shoes carried me through. The new shoes carry me forward. If this story moved you, I'd be grateful if you'd leave a comment below. Tell me, what would you have done in my place? Share this with someone who needs to hear that it's never too late to stand up for yourself. And if you want more stories about father revenge and justice, please subscribe to Father's Vengeance. Your support means everything. Thank you for staying until the very end. It takes courage to listen to hard truths about family and betrayal. One final note. While this story contains fictionalized elements for storytelling, impact the lessons about standing up, using your knowledge, and protecting what you've built are real. May you never need them, but may you always be ready.